The long death. This is about the death of Native American civilization on the Great Plains. The long death. After the Civil War was over in 1865, Westward Expansion, the American people moving west, picked up steam again. The Civil War had been such a significant event that it had largely stopped westward expansion as North-South fought over whose vision for the country would be successful. But after the war was over then, the American people began to move west again, and this time, instead of going all the way across the Great Plains and all the way across the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Coast, Oregon, California, etc., already states by now, they decided that perhaps those Great Plains were worthy of settlement. And some people even went to the mountains for mining and so forth. And so the interior of the country begins to fill in. The frontier then begins to disappear in the last third of the 19th century. This period from 1865 to 1890 is indeed often referred to as the last frontier in the West. It's the era from which Hollywood, the movie industry, television, has derived its mythology of the Old West. It comes from this point of time, from 1865 to roughly 1900. In the mid-20th century, that period of time when I was born and the boomers were born, if you turned on a television program, the chances that it was a Western were about 90%. And if you went to the movies in the middle of the 20th century, the chances that it was a Western film was about 50%. Westerns dominated American entertainment in terms of television and movies. Today, only occasionally does a really good, high-budget Western come out, and whenever it does, of course, I run to the theater because I want to see something like that. When I'm at home in the afternoons, late in the evenings, I'm watching a movie, it's likely to be an old Western that I've probably seen 3 or 4 times already. Because that culture so impacted me. That's what I like. And my parents and that generation were even more so. And so America then derives much of its mythology from this period that both in film and also in books, magazines, contributed so much to American identity in the 20th century, the late 19th century. The most popular of these television shows in the middle of the 20th century was Gunsmoke, starring James Arness. And of course, the great movie hero of this time was John Wayne. This is John Wayne in Stagecoach, 1939. And it was the film Stagecoach that made John Wayne famous. He emerged from the drudgery of B-movies in the 1930s to become a star. The most iconic star in American cinema in the 20th century, followed closely probably by Humphrey Bogart. So the last third of the 19th century was the era of the mining camps in the mountains. It's the era of the ghost towns. It's the era of the cowboy and the cattle drives. It's the time when vast ranches of tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of acres sprawled across the West. It's the era of the Indian Wars. The slaughter of the great buffalo herds. The coming of the railroad, which symbolized civilization and further transformation. And it was the time when justice, if there was any justice, was often found at the end of a gun barrel or the end of a rope with no juries around. Outlaws like Jesse James and Billy the Kid challenged the very notion of civilization, and they were fought by lawmen who sometimes were only barely on the right side of the law, like Wild Bill Hickok and the Earp brothers in Tombstone, Arizona. They fought these outlaws for control of the West. for civilization. This period was remarkably short given the extent of the American experience that we grant to it the kind of impact on the culture that I've already described. To this day, people who are critical of the United States, especially in terms of their foreign policy, call the President of the United States, whether he's a Republican or a Democrat, a cowboy. Meaning he's kind of a loose cannon. You never know what he's going to do from one moment to the next, that cowboy, right? He doesn't know how to behave in polite society. In 1890 then, the Census Bureau finally decided that you could not point to some place out west where there was a frontier line. That there had been, in the ensuing years, enough settlement out west that there was no longer a, quote, frontier. Not that it was all settled in, but you could see that there wasn't a vast expanse of no settlement anymore. 1890. And this got the attention of an historian by the name of Frederick Jackson Turner. And here's another clue as to how to do reading. And again, it doesn't matter what discipline you're in. Let's say you're in a sociology class and your sociology text tells you about a famous sociologist. Pay attention. Because your sociology teacher is probably impressed with that famous sociologist and wants you to know about that person. Just as your historian professor wants you to know about famous historians, and Frederick Jackson Turner is certainly that. And so, depending on the discipline that you're reading, when you read about a famous person in that discipline, you pay attention. In this case, Frederick Jackson Turner contributes to our understanding of why we are the way we are. This is not just history, it's sociology, it's psychology, etc. It's enormous. And Turner took that fact that the frontier no longer existed, and he started thinking about it. So that meant that there had always been a frontier, and now in 1890 it wasn't one. And he thought that was significant. About 3 years later, he wrote a paper that he presented at a major historical conference in Chicago, 1893, in which he argued that the frontier, the existence of the frontier, had had a tremendous impact on the American mind, the way the American people thought and think. In other words, why we are the way we are. And Turner said there'd always been a frontier from the very first time those Puritans or English people had stepped on North America. Right there at their toe was the frontier, wasn't it? Everything on the inside was wilderness to them. Not that it wasn't settled by Native Americans, but as far as they were concerned, it's wild, it's frontier. And so now they have to make a living by themselves, on their own. And some of them won't. Many will die. This frontier moves all the way across the country as the centuries passed until in 1890, it's no longer there. This frontier experience then shapes the American mind. People who moved out onto the frontier and hacked a living out of the wilderness felt pretty good about themselves. I did it. I survived. I lived. I made a new farm, you see. And my wife right next to me, she helped me do this. And my sons and my daughters, they helped us build this new life. But we did it by ourselves, with our own two hands. The government didn't help us. There weren't very many friends and neighbors very close, and so that wasn't a community effort. It was an individual effort. And what was most important about it was I was free. I was free to do this. And so Turner argues then that frontier experience, that freedom, that emphasis on the individual seeps into the way Americans think. They prize individualism, they prize freedom. And then because they started to respect anybody else like them who did the same thing, they prized that equality, you see. And so here we have it, freedom, equality, begins to impact Americans because of the frontier, Turner argues, in ways that it doesn't in France, or Russia, or Germany, or England, We are different. We are unique because of this frontier experience. But I also want to point out to you that this individualism that is now being prized by many, many Americans is contrary to Christianity. Yeah? Christianity is a communal religion. All Christians, all denominations, all forms of Christianity prize the community, the church, the parish, you see. We work together. We build our church together. We spread the gospel together, you see. Whereas now in America, there's many Americans saying, no, I did it. And by the way, don't ever stop me from doing it either, see? Individualism. So you have competing ideology. There's the individualism now aspect added on to Enlightenment philosophy that I talked about the other day, also the Christian ethos as well. You see? Complex, isn't it? Yeah. And then how you vote politically will depend upon how each of these various aspects has impacted your mind and what you value. Key point, Americans. They are all Americans. See, they're all Americans. So just to review, Turner believed that the frontier had fostered an individualistic, freedom-loving personality, opposed to any notion that one white man was better than another white man. This emphasis on freedom, equality, and individualism now was very different from Christian communitarianism. So the West was filling up in the 1870s and the 1880s. Settlers like the Burtons and Shimerdas of the novel you were reading, My Antonia, were drawn to the plains. And the miners were drawn to the mountains. And the federal government also helped grow the population out west. You might find this surprising. The Homestead Act of 1862, passed in the middle of the Civil War, provided a settler with 160 acres of almost free land out west. All you had to do was move out there onto the appropriately designated land and survive for 5 years, and it's yours. The survival for 5 years was the hard part. You may be surprised to learn that this federal government program was sponsored by the party in power at this time, the party of Lincoln, the Republican Party. Now, why would you be surprised to learn that the Republican Party had sponsored a federal program to help the average American? Yes?
They don't really do that nowadays.
Yeah, so if you had to choose between the two modern political parties, Republicans and Democrats, as to which would be the most likely to sponsor a federal program to help the average American, you should know that that's most likely to be a Democratic program. Okay? If you don't know that, you have a lot to learn. But fortunately, you're in the right class. So the Republican Party under Lincoln is an activist party in terms of helping the American people. This is just one example. The reason why we have all those state universities, you know, guys who play football, the Ohio State University, Washington State, Oregon State, federal program for land-grant colleges sponsored by, you guessed it, the Republican Party under Lincoln. The migration of whites onto the high plains and the mountains, of course, brought two cultures now into conflict. The Plains Indian with his reliance on the vast and wild buffalo herds, and white civilization with its reliance on agriculture, corn, wheat, domesticated cattle, sheep, chickens, And then, of course, the railroads that will come in order to take the produce from those farms back east to the markets. The decimation of the buffalo. The coming of the whites to the plains after the Civil War sealed the fate of the buffalo, and in sealing the fate of the buffalo, seals the fate of the Plains Indian. They could not coexist, these two different cultures, white culture and Native American Plains Indian culture. You see, the nomadic buffalo would trample any crop, corn, wheat, etc., that was growing out on the plains where they were used to grazing. They would trample over railroad tracks and destroy the ties. Imagine you're a farmer out there in central Kansas in this time, and you hear a rumble off in the distance. Your wheat's about half grown. First thing you do is look up in the sky and try to find the thunder, because the thunder and a heavy rainfall at the wrong time can destroy that wheat crop. But there's not a cloud in the sky. Now you're really worried. And in a few minutes, you see it coming over the hill off to the west. It's just a dark cloud that seems to cover the golden prairie. And now you know what it is. You're just praying, though, that it turns away. It's a buffalo herd coming your way. And unless it turns away, it is going to destroy your crop. It might even destroy your little sod house that you cut into the side of a hill. Where are you going to hide? Will you ever be able to recover your cows and your chickens? Will they survive? You see, the cultures are in conflict, cannot coexist. Making matters worse for the Plains Indian, buffalo hides became very, very valuable commodities for leather articles once a tanning process that was able to cope with the thickness of the buffalo hide became possible in the 1870s. So now professional hunting parties formed in order to go out and kill the buffalo. They left the meat, they just took the hide and sent it back east. William F. Buffalo Bill Cody makes his name killing buffalo by the hundreds. The Indians soon realized what was happening to the basic support of their entire culture. Killing the buffalo removed their ability to live on the plains. The buffalo was their primary food source. The buffalo skin created the covering for their teepees. And then the buffalo innards, all kinds of valuable things. You could turn a buffalo stomach into something that carried water. Or you could turn it into a ball and kick it around the village. Buffalo tongues were delicacies. Even the crap from the buffalo was valuable. Yeah, that's right. Dung, right? D-U-N-G. What do you do with dung on the prairies? Yes. And so all the little kids from the village, their job was to go out every morning and to pick up the buffalo dung. And the 3-year-olds, they learned very quickly which buffalo dung to pick up and which to, wait for a week, right? Because you wanted it to be dry. It's not going to burn if it's wet. Besides, you're going to get your hands all messed up, aren't you? Yeah. So you became an expert on buffalo dung at the age of 3, right? Yeah. So buffalo dung burns. That's where the fire comes from. There's no trees. In order to get poles for those teepees, they had to go a long ways into the mountains, but they can't do that for firewood every day. Buffalo is the essence of the culture of the Plains Indian. And so the Indians hated the buffalo hunters, and they attacked them without mercy. There wasn't going to be a conversation between Native Americans and buffalo hunters. Oh, please go the other way. No, if you're a buffalo hunter in the wrong place at the wrong time, you're just dead. Not going to ask any questions. You were trying to kill us, you see. Slowly but surely. Then when the U.S. government did not follow through on its promises of money and food, this also prompted the Native Americans to go on the warpath. By this time, almost all the tribes had some kind of a treaty arrangement in which the government was supposed to supply some form of income and food, medicine, blankets, things like that, and then oftentimes did not keep their promises. The story of Adobe walls is symbolic of this conflict on the plains. You see, the Texas Panhandle, that part of northern Texas that kind of sticks up, that's a panhandle, had been reserved to Native Americans and their buffalo herds by treaty. But in 1873, settlers in Kansas, just north of that place, Oklahoma and the Panhandle and so forth, settlers in Kansas were plagued by a drought and a famine. Not enough to drink, not enough to eat. Buffalo hunters were sent out to find the great herds and relieve the famine, bring the meat back. They couldn't find any buffalo in Kansas this year. Some of the hunters now asked the army commander in the area, what will happen if we were to go into Indian territory, the Panhandle, to hunt for buffalo? Colonel Richard Dodge, whose duty it was to enforce the law being the treaties that the United States has approved with Native Americans, responded to this question. He said, boys, if I were a buffalo hunter, I'd hunt where the buffalo are. It was virtual permission. In other words, the army isn't going to do anything if you invade Indian territory in search of buffalo. And this was completely contrary to Colonel Dodge's obligation to uphold the Constitution of the United States. But it was representative of what the Army was thinking at this time, because you see, when the Native Americans went off the reservation, when they went to places they weren't supposed to go, they would cause a lot of trouble. And so the Army then had to respond. And so the Army now develops the policy of denying Native Americans their food supply, so they can't afford to go off the reservation. Well, ambitious merchants heard of the buffalo hunters' plan to leave Kansas to go into northern Texas. And so they decided to follow the buffalo hunters so they could set up a small trading post, saloon, restaurant, etc. The makeshift town is located in the Texas Panhandle. It's largely constructed of sod and a few timbers. The ruins are still there. It's called Adobe walls, mud walls. It's the spring of 1874. And so the hunting parties, the buffalo hunting parties of the white men now got up early every morning and they went out into the grasslands to hunt buffalo. But they would usually come back to the safety of their numbers at Adobe walls and a few rudimentary defensive works, because this is dangerous work. This is Comanche territory. They're illegally there, and the Comanches know it. And they're there to hunt and kill buffalo, and they know that too. And so now the Comanches begin to attack the buffalo hunters out during the daytime when they're out there by themselves. And a few of the buffalo hunters are killed and scalped doing this. Now, even before the arrival of the intrepid souls at Adobe walls, the Comanches, led by their famous chief, Quanah Parker, who was the son of a white woman who had been captured by the Comanches, and then she married a chief and lived with the Comanches for many, many years, and Quanah Parker was her son. He rises to become the great war chief of the Comanches. Well, Quanah Parker and other Comanche leaders had their grievances with their arrangement with the federal government. Payments from the federal government for giving up portions of their land were late, and hunger was very much a part of the existence of the Comanches. Coincidentally, there arose about this time an Indian by the name of Isatai. Now, he's not Quanah Parker, he's a different Indian. Quanah Parker is a war chief. Isatai is a medicine man, a spiritual leader. And Isatai claimed to be a medicine man with great power. He told his tribe that he could cure diseases. Now remember, this is a time of great psychological distress and rapid change for the Comanche. Life is not the way it used to be. This is spiritual stress as well. And so here's a medicine man, a religious leader who claims to be able to raise the dead, to cure diseases, to control the weather. And he even says to Comanche braves that if you follow me, you will be impervious to the white man's bullets. They cannot kill you. Now, what would we do, being modern scientific Americans, with claims like this? We would stand that guy up against a tree and fire some shots at him, right? Sure we would. Scientific method. But not if you're desperate to believe, right? Not if you really want to believe. Here's the psychology of it, right? Isatai, no doubt, believes this himself. He's sincere. And so this great psychological distress, this transformative time has grabbed the Comanche nation. This is not the only time something like this will happen to Native Americans in this period. After lengthy deliberations, the Comanches decided to attack Adobe walls, wipe out the little community, wipe out the buffalo hunters, eliminate the lawless invasion of their territory. One thing that history is supposed to do is provide the student of history with some empathy for other people. It's hard to put yourself back in this time and strip away everything you know. But I've lived a long time. And I'm pretty sure I know myself well enough to know that if I had been a Comanche, I'd have been right behind Isatai. Yeah. I'd have been desperate. I wouldn't have wanted my son to die, my daughter to die of hunger. I'd have been willing to do anything to not see that. Well, the sun had not yet given full light on May 27, 1874, when the Comanches came screaming into Adobe walls. And one thing you will not find on the test here in a couple of weeks is what was the date of the attack on the settlement of Adobe walls. Who cares? May 27th, May 28th, does not matter except to those people. Right? Doesn't matter to us. Why is what matters to us. Why? What was happening to these Comanches? What was happening to the white people? How was the country being transformed? What was going on? That's what matters to us. Two brothers had decided to sleep out in the back of a wagon bed that night. It was May. It was in Texas. It's hot. Bad decision. They hear the screaming of the Comanches as they come riding into the town at full gallop, and they sit up in the back of the wagon and arrows right in the chest. These two brothers, first to die. Inside the buildings, such as they were, most of the whites were awake and starting to get ready for the day. And so here they hear the Comanches coming into the town. They grab their buffalo guns. This is not your normal collection of white pioneers, is it? These guys are hunters by trade. And these buffalo guns are 60 caliber weapons. There were 27 whites, most of them expert marksmen. They're attempting to fend off about 500 Comanches, so the Comanches got the numbers. But what are the Comanches expecting? Psychology again. What are they expecting? that they're impervious to bullets, right? They're going to wipe these whites out in 5 minutes. And so now the buffalo hunters are firing from inside the little buildings of adobe walls, and it only takes a matter of a few seconds for them to start knocking Comanches off their horses. Now the psychology shifts within a matter of moments. Isatai is a false prophet. Now the Comanches skedaddle out of adobe walls. They're leaving dead all over the little dusty streets. They retreat to a safe distance. They discuss amongst themselves what they're going to do. Do you know what the Comanches did? They spent the rest of the day in groups trying to recover their dead. And more died doing that. They didn't get them all back. Isatai on his pony retreats to a hill that he thought was plenty far away from the buffalo hunters. He's over there by himself. He's now being reviled by his own warriors. They want nothing to do with him. He's a false prophet. They're laughing at him, jeering him. There was a buffalo hunter by the name of Billy Dixon who was reputed even before this shot to have been one of the great shots in the West. So he levels his buffalo rifle at the brave off in the distance and fires a shot, and Isatai is lucky because it kills his horse and knocks him, of course, down into the dust. That night, the Comanches rode away, leaving a number of their dead there on the streets of adobe walls. Isatai had been one more disappointment in a long trail of broken hopes. In July now, the hunters, the merchants, and all the rest of the white people picked up everything they had. They'd been sending meat, of course, back by wagons for quite some time, and they abandoned adobe walls and they went back to Kansas. But not before they took the dead braves, cut off their heads, and placed those heads on the posts of the corral that they had built for their ponies. The Red River War. The trouble at adobe walls escalated into what historians call the Red River War in 1874-75. Having learned from experience, which is another way to say history, the Comanches decided that attacking settlements like adobe walls was not real healthy. Wasn't cost effective. So now, how about attacking the farms and ranches out across the Great Plains where you have isolated settler families? Granted, these people had nothing to do with the incursion into Indian land, but nevertheless, what else can you do? And so the Red River War now is launched against these farms and ranches out in the southern Great Plains. And now it's the white people who have no chance. Now what happens? The call goes out to the United States Army to come round up the savages, to protect us from death. And so now the United States Cavalry responds. You've got to go find the Comanches. You've got to bring them to justice. And again, there's no contest here either, ultimately. Cavalry's going to win. The last warriors were captured and the war came to an end in 1875. Now the buffalo hunters returned to the Texas Panhandle to finish the work that they had begun a year earlier and to eliminate the Comanches' food supply, thus making the Comanches entirely dependent upon the federal government for everything they require to live. It doesn't take long to eliminate the great buffalo herds. Summary. So from the close of the Red River War in 1875, no free Indians were left. They're all severely confined on the southern plains. The mountains are not taken yet. The northern plains are not taken yet. But on the southern plains, the Comanches and their allies are controlled at the end of the Red River War. But events were also closing in on the Native Americans of the northern plains as well. These are the Sioux and the Nez Perce and the Cheyenne. And that same dreary history would be repeated for these people as it already had been scores of times. Native Americans would agree to abide in certain areas. And in the beginning, the reservations were very large. Whites, usually civilians, did not abide by the agreements. Miners especially were notorious for invading Indian lands in search of gold and silver and such. The Indians attacked the violators, the invaders of their reserved areas. Then the army was called out because whites are being killed. And they round up the Indians. And every time this happened, the Native Americans were constricted further and further down in terms of the size of the reservation. They lose more and more land. Questions? Yes?
You mentioned, I drove when you first taken Parker.
Yeah, Quanah Parker.
Yeah. How, with the level to which the two sort of sides of things bordered on each other, how common was it for there to be like friendly relations between people and even like children who were
So relations like that are always complicated because you can always find exceptions to whatever the norm is, right? But at this point, white people of Texas hate the Comanches more than any other tribe. The Kiowas are down there as well and a few other tribes, but it's the Comanches who have the most fearsome reputation. It was the Comanches who were the most aggressive, who had the largest empire, if you will. So it's the Comanches that are the most feared and the most hated. Just to give you an example, Quanah Parker's mother was captured, right, and then spent her life, most of her life, with the Comanches. So long, so that when she was finally returned to her family, she did not want to be a white person anymore. See, she didn't fit in anymore. All right, God bless you all.